Welcome to FedSoc Forums, a podcast of the Federal Society's practice groups. I'm Nate Kazmarek, Vice President and Director of Practice Groups at the Federal Society. For exclusive access to live recordings of FedSoc Forum programs, become a Federal Society member today at fedsoc.org.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's FedSoc Forum. Today, February 7th, 2024, we are excited to present Henry Kissinger and International Law. My name is Jack Capizzi, and I'm an Assistant Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that all expressions of opinion are those of the experts on today's call. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Professor Thomas Schwartz, a distinguished professor of history and a professor of political science and European studies, and a director of undergraduate studies at Vanderbilt University. He is also the author of Henry Kissinger and American Power. We are also joined by Professor Jeremi Suri, who is the Mack Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs and a professor of public affairs and history at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also the author of Henry Kissinger and the American Century, and he is the host of the This is Democracy podcast. Our moderator today is Professor John Yoo, who is the Emanuel S. Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. After our speakers have given their remarks, we will turn to you, the audience, for any questions you might have. If you have a question at any point, please just type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will handle those as we can towards the end of the program. With that, thank you all very much for being with us today. Professor Yoo, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks to the Federal Society for organizing this important forum. And also, I really want to thank our two guests, Professor Thomas Schwartz, Professor Jeremi Suri from Vanderbilt and University of Texas. I'm just going to play a moderator role. Each speaker will have about 10 to 15 minutes to discuss the issue before us about Henry Kissinger, international politics, international law. Then we'll have some time set aside for them to respond to each other. And then about 20 minutes, I hope, for questions from all of you using the chat function, which I'll read off. Just in the interest of full disclosure, Tom Schwartz was a professor of mine in college, and he gave me the important advice: don't go to graduate school, get a law degree. I think the law may be worse off for his advice, but it was certainly better for me. But my heart of hearts, I would love to have done what Tom and Jeremi do for a living. And I just want to say that because I think this is great that the Federal Society is inviting non-law speakers, people who we think of as the real experts about the facts, when we then make legal arguments against it. And I hope we are going to do a lot more of this in the future. And I can't think of a better topic and better speakers than two prime diplomatic historians talking about Kissinger. So we did the coin toss in the beginning, and Jeremi lost, so he goes first. And Tom has asked to receive in the second half. Jeremi, why don't you begin? Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for your very kind introduction. Thank you to the Federalist Society for organizing this. Thank you to all the people who have given time to be a part of our discussion. Most of all, I want to thank my friend Tom Schwartz for doing this with me. Tom was not ever formally my teacher, but I sort of feel like he's one of the great figures in our field who's always been a mentor and a friend to me. I've known him since I was in graduate school, and it's really a pleasure to do anything with Tom. And I'm delighted that both he and I have tried to make sense of what one cannot really make sense of, which is the brain of Henry Kissinger. It is so sui generis. And even at 100, it was still a machine without parallel. And I'm delighted that we have a chance to talk about this today, particularly the topic of international law, because I think this is one of many areas, but certainly one of the key areas where Kissinger is often misunderstood. The standard thing you'll hear from polemicists and from some scholars who maybe haven't approached things with the depth that Tom and I have, they'll say that he didn't care about international law, that he was this sort of quintessential Machiavellian figure who, of course, the term Machiavellian doesn't even reflect Machiavelli's thinking, ends justify the means, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's way off base. There are many things perhaps to criticize in the way Kissinger conceptualized and implemented his ideas about international law, but there's no doubt that he came out of, from the very beginning, a tradition seeped in thinking about international law. One of the main points of my book, which is as much an intellectual history as it is a diplomatic history, Tom's book is wonderful in its detailed analysis of a lot of Kissinger's policymaking. My book is trying to understand where Kissinger comes from. One of the central points of my book is that he really is the figure in American policymaking who brings late 19th century German intellectual thought into the world of American policy. The most important figures in his intellectual development were figures like Carl Friedrich, Hans Morgenthau, Oswald Spengler, to some extent Carl Schmitt. And he thinks of the world, and this is where there's a tension between his thinking and a Wilsonian American discourse. He has trouble thinking of the world in ways that are built around democracy and liberalism. He thinks much more in terms of German thought from the late 19th century. How would I characterize that? A world that is built around hierarchy, a world that is built around Bildung, notions of particular ideas having precedence over others. Culture and law are one and the same for Kissinger, as they were for most 19th century German thinkers, and power is culturally defined, but it is culture not in a democratic vector. It is culture in a hierarchical, meritocratic vector, and one that reflects what he sees as large conglomerations of cultural, political, and military achievement. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons I think he was drawn to China from a very early period. There's no doubt that Richard Nixon also was drawn to China for his own reasons. But Kissinger, I think, although not an expert on China, certainly early in his career, quite naturally saw China as the Germany of Asia. And I think in some moments he thought of Persia and Iran as the Germany of the Middle East, right? These long-standing cultures of power, these long-standing nodes of achievement, and intellectual civilizational accomplishment. And that's a very 19th century German way of thinking. From Carl Friedrich, who was one of Kissinger's most important intellectual teachers at Harvard and thereafter, from Friedrich he learned, I think, a conception of international law that was really built around rules, norms, and federalism, but federalism not in an American sense. It was to be a world where there were rules. Unlike Hedley Bull and others who are of a similar generation, he did not see anarchy in the world, Kissinger. He saw oligopoly. He saw large entities vying for power, and of course, the role of many other smaller entities in that larger ecosystem. It was an ecosystem that was oligopolist, where many of the smaller actors played an important role as coalition builders. Kissinger is really one of the first Americans to make the case that multipolarity is better than bipolarity for this reason, right? The standard way of thinking about the Cold War from George Kennan forward was a world that was bipolar. Kissinger always thought of it as multipolar. He always thought of it in this great power context of the 19th century. So international law served a set of needs. This is what he gets from Friedrich, I think. Rules of the game, things you do and things you don't do, norms, and they fundamentally serve to create order, to preserve order. And I think some people have taken the Spenglerian influences on Kissinger too far, but they're definitely there. He's definitely a declinist. He's definitely one who sees that an international system that's unregulated, that doesn't have some kind of legal authority, is an international system that will careen to disaster, which is, of course, his explanation for World War I, which was a standard explanation at the time. International rules are designed to mediate conflict. They're designed to arbitrate conflict, and they're designed to provide predictability, so leaders don't make mistakes. Within that context, international law for Kissinger was not democratic and it was not judicial. It was enforced by the largest actors. Again, this is a very 19th century German way of thinking about this, that the law overlaps with the responsibility of the largest actors in that. Much of Kissinger's career, I think, can be defined as his efforts to educate Americans what he thought was their role in the world as enforcers of a certain set of norms, a certain order in the world, that of course would serve American interests, but would serve the interests of other countries as well. And I think this is one of the many reasons toward the end of his life, while he was so alarmed by the belligerent, conflictual framing of U.S.-China relations. Because for Kissinger, the future of Asia was to be a regulated, legally managed world order in Asia, where the United States and China were the first among equals, and able to manage relationships in that context. This is why he liked the European Union. People forget he was an advocate of the European Union. He's infamously quoted for saying that there was no one in charge of the European Union, but that was the whole point for him. It was to be a coalition, a federalist coalition of states that would manage law and order within this part of the world, and would work very well for that purpose for him. So international law was to be made, enforced by the largest states, by the states that were the highest achieving, and they were to see responsibility that they had for smaller states as well, as smaller states were to see responsibilities toward them. The states, for Kissinger, in his model of international law, are the receptacles of power, but the real sources of legitimacy, and he writes about legitimacy quite a lot, especially from his dissertation forward, the sources of legitimacy were cultural. Why was it that the United States had a role to play in the world? It wasn't simply because we were a powerful country, a rich country. It was because we were a center of cultural production. We were a center of achievement. And this is why Kissinger's international legal theorizing and thinking can look racist and culturally condescending to some. Because it is culturally condescending, because it is built around the notion that all cultures are not equal. It is built around the notion that all civilizations are not equal. And it's not an on or off switch either. It's a very hierarchical world. And again, someone coming from his intellectual tradition, that should not be surprising to us at all. Hans Morgenthau thought of the world that way. In fact, most of the emigre intellectuals, including Hannah Arendt, if you push them, would think about the world in these terms. And it meant that military power was actually not the end-all, be-all. For Kissinger, diplomacy was the place where culture and military power came together. And I think that's the best way to understand so many of his diplomatic initiatives, whether we're talking about China, or we're talking about détente, or we're talking about shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East, which of course has taken on a new relevance recently, right? Tony Blinken is kind of trying to recreate this. For Kissinger, Egypt played a particularly important role, not simply because it was a powerful neighbor to Israel, but because it was a legitimate center of cultural power. Kissinger agreed with Sadat that Egypt was the rightful cultural center for at least one main part of the Arab world. And Kissinger had no time for Palestinians because he saw them as not culturally significant. Whether that's right or wrong, we can debate, but that's how he saw the world. And I think the power of his vision was he was able to effectuate, based on a clairvoyant understanding, a mapping of the world in this way. I just wanted to say a couple of other things about the application then of international law. Kissinger was skeptical of international institutions. He was skeptical of those international institutions because he believed they would be hijacked by one of his overriding fears, which was populism. And I wanted to tell one story, which is that years ago, we were at a dinner. This was a dinner with the New York Historical Society. It was when my book had come out. And at that point, he was happy with the book. Later, he wasn't. I should be clear on that. But we were sitting at dinner, and this was 2008. In the spring of 2008, and it just looked like candidate Barack Obama was going to seal up the Democratic nomination. And I said to Dr. Kissinger, I said, you know, I've gone to a few rallies. I was then at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was on the faculty there. I was like, I'm excited, regardless of what you think about Obama, I'm excited that so many young people are excited. I'm glad to see. And he said to me, and I think this was a very honest moment, he said, you know, when I see large numbers of people excited at rallies, I'm not sure that's what we want in our politics. I'm not sure that's the politics we want. That applies to his view of domestic politics, by the way. I don't think he was opposed to civil rights, but he was never a civil rights marcher, even though many Jews of his generation were. But I think it also applies to his understanding of international institutions, because he had witnessed the United Nations, in a sense, get captured, get perhaps overtaken by a kind of populism, and he was fearful that other institutions would fall that way. International law was to be implemented by the most capable powers and by the leaders of the most capable powers. He was explicitly elitist about this. We don't have to like it, but we have to recognize it and recognize the power of that vision. I think it allowed him to effectuate change. It allowed him to do things. It was also a world that was Federalist in Carl Friedrich's thinking, which is to say nested levels of authority. The United States was to have primary influence in its own area, in its own country, in its own continent, but then secondary influence in a transatlantic space, tertiary influence thereon. It was a world of nested sovereignties. I spend a lot of time trying to explain to my students, I don't think I have to explain to this audience, that sovereignty is not an all or nothing. There are different degrees of sovereignty, and for him, the world was one of different levels, different concentric circles of sovereignty. The United States perhaps having the largest piece, but having limitations as well as many levels to its sovereignty. And then the final point was that his notion of international law was not to be subjected to elections. He was skeptical, and I've come to agree with him more and more over time, that elections actually produce the kinds of leadership and serious thinking that we would hope to see. I guess another way of putting that is he anticipated all the problems of crowdsourcing very early on. For him, international law was to have its own international standing. It was to be recognized as a discipline, as a way of thinking, and people were to be educated into it. There's a Platonic element to this. It wasn't to be static, but it wasn't to be a popularity contest as well. And this is why time and again the criticisms of the unpopularity of some of his policies actually didn't shatter his confidence. It actually reinforced much of his thinking on that. Just a final word. I've talked for about 12, 13 minutes. Just a final word I wanted to say is I don't think we have to buy his vision of international law wholly or even mostly, but I think there are a lot of insights into it. And the one I just take away most today when I look at places like the Middle East or I look at Ukraine are the perils of trying to build international law without the strong buy-in of the most powerful actors. Whether we agree normatively as to whether that should be true or not doesn't really matter. I think the historical record, I'm guessing Tom will agree, is that it's whether we want to or not, great powers have to be at the center of international law. There have to be laws and rules, and the great powers have to be key actors. We as a country have to recognize that and convince ourselves of that. I think it's atrocious that we're considering abandoning the Ukrainians. That's just my view, and I think Kissinger would find that atrocious as well. But we also have to get the buy-in from other countries, and we have to do work to build a system, not of international intervention in Ukraine, but of consensus, law, and the enforcement of that law by the most powerful actors in the way that's most effective. So I will leave it there. Tom, to you.
The answers are wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. We're going to turn over to Professor Schwartz. Just a short comment. Jeremy's remarks make me think that if he could have, Kissinger would have claimed co-authorship of the Federalist Papers too, because a lot of first, he thought he wrote all the great ideas in our time, but more importantly, a lot of things that Jeremy say really sort of echo or resound from themes in the Federalist Papers, which a lot of people in the audience, of course, read and are very familiar with. But that was wonderful. Professor Schwartz, please.
Oh, well, after that, I really, Jeremy has provided a really extraordinary understanding for Kissinger and international law that I had a problem initially with even the subject, because not that I dismissed his ideas on international law, it's just that it's not something that I found him very engaged in as a policymaker. And it was a little hard for me to conceptualize what I wanted to say about it in that case. The other thing was that I was thinking as this forum was developed, I was thinking of all the accusations against Kissinger, namely for violating international law, for being, in effect, what Rolling Stone and what many on the left in the United States called a war criminal after his death. And anyone who followed the reactions of some after his death recognizes that he was accused constantly of all sorts of crimes against international law in that period. And I wanted to, in a sense, say a little bit about that as well in the course of this. And recognizing, I think Jeremy's sense of Kissinger's intellectual history is one that I share. His book was very fundamental in my thinking about Kissinger's background. But here's where I was thinking. My book originated in the concept or the idea of using Kissinger's biography to talk in some manner about the history of American foreign relations, to use biography as a lens through which to see what I called at that time the dilemmas of American power. In a way, it was the initial spur for the book series was this notion of teaching history through biography, which has its problems, but also is very effective. I think in general, people respond to biography much better than they do to more abstract historical works. And I saw Kissinger's biography particularly as encapsulating the rise of America to its great power status, and then to Kissinger's own exercise of power as both National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State, and for a period of time as Secretary of State, almost as President for Foreign Policy. Kissinger's life, of course, from his birth in Germany, his emigration after the Nazis came to power, then his return in the form of an American occupation regime, and his ascendancy through what Jeremi called, well, a Cold War university, Harvard University at that time, is a pretty remarkable story. And it does capture aspects of the American century, the American period of power in the 20th century. But my book really, in terms of any contribution intellectually, starts with Kissinger coming to be Richard Nixon's national security advisor in 1969. This was a post that I argue in my book, which Richard Nixon wanted. He recognized in Henry Kissinger an extraordinary talent in both bureaucratic maneuvering and power and understanding how to make the bureaucracy work. He wanted to use Kissinger as national security advisor to bring foreign policy making into the White House, to also ensure that the foreign policy decisions and particular innovations of the Nixon administration would redound to his political credit. His reelection as president was one of his foremost objectives from the very moment he became president. And he saw, particularly in changing American foreign policy, in moving away from what one might argue was the Kennedy pay any price, bear any burden view of American leadership, to one which did retrench American power, but did it in a creative way in which kept the United States as an important player in the international system. And in that sense, Kissinger was, although he had his own ideas, he also was he worked with Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon had certain objectives. And fundamental to my book is a take on Henry Kissinger that is a little different from what others wrote before me in terms of stressing. Other historians did stress more Kissinger's ideas, his role as a theorist, the background of his ideas, particularly his embrace of what's called Realpolitik, the German word for approaching foreign policy with an emphasis on states protecting and furthering their national interests, largely devoid of ideology or moral considerations. My emphasis was on Kissinger as a political figure, a politician, someone who recognized how significant domestic politics were in carrying out foreign policy, and who worked to facilitate that both for President Nixon and ultimately for President Ford as well, seeing in foreign policy very much an aspect of the domestic battles in the United States, of a way to help his political masters, his political, those who he worked for. There was a moment, I think, when Kissinger himself sort of, I don't have many good stories. I only met with Kissinger once for an interview. He was not particularly thrilled with the idea of my book. As he said, when I told him I was going to write something short, he said, "You will leave things out." And so I knew that, but he was kind in other respects. And particularly, one of the references I found that I tell in my book is when he was discussing the Middle East, an area where he played a particularly crucial role and wanted to be shaping policy. And he was annoyed with Nixon and he made a remark about that damn constitutional amendment that he wanted the Republicans to push through to let a foreign-born person become president of the United States. So he had his own visions at times. He did serve Nixon in particular ways, and I think here goes to the what I had thought about with international law, namely to many of the accusations against him. Christopher Hitchens, who was really most responsible in the trial of Henry Kissinger, argued that there were three fundamental areas where Kissinger could be seen as a war criminal or be brought before international law. One was in the bombing of Cambodia. The second was in the overturning of the Chilean government of Salvador Allende. And the third was in the support given to General Suharto in suppressing the East Timor rebellion in 1975. In terms of the Vietnam War, Kissinger did obviously come in, I think, skeptical of the war, believing, though, it needed to be ended in a manner that somehow preserved American credibility, which was also something Richard Nixon believed. Nixon believed that he could end the war in a manner that Eisenhower had ended the Korean War, and preserve a independent South Vietnam. He wanted to go beyond, he wanted to demonstrate to the North Vietnamese that he would go beyond the tactics that were used by the Johnson administration. And so one of those was to bomb North Vietnamese installations in Cambodia, which he did with fervor, and which Kissinger thought was also a very important step in trying to lead to a settlement in Vietnam. Kissinger at this time was also trying to further Nixon's so-called madman theory by meeting with the Russian ambassador and suggesting that Nixon might have lost his mind if he can't end the Vietnam War. Jeremi has written about the nuclear alert that Nixon launched in October of '69. So there were all these attempts to end the war, frustrated by the fact Hanoi would not go along with it. And in fact, the expansion of the war and the Cambodian bombing, I think, is part of that. To the extent that Cambodia was a part of the Vietnam War, I think any indictment of Henry Kissinger has to recognize that the war was a product of many American administrations and leaders, and that singling him out for the role on the bombing of Cambodia is, I think, misguided and overwhelmingly, I think, misses the degree to which this was part of a larger conflict that American leaders had launched in terms of the containment policy and the prevention of communist expansion that had been the theme of American foreign policy since 1945. On the Chilean case, I think I am more critical, but I think that Chile represented particularly the sensitivity of Richard Nixon to communism in Latin America, something that he had seen in the Cuban case and had been very sensitive to, and that he was particularly determined to get the CIA involved in. Kissinger, again, served as the point man for this. I don't think he cared a great deal about Chile at all, but he did further covert activities that were designed to prevent Allende from coming to power, one of which resulted in the death of General Rene Schneider in Chile. I think in this case, I think we can be very critical of the administration for attempting this, since I think it was an overreaction to the Chilean situation, but I don't think it amounts to a criminal indictment. And even in East Timor, which I think the United States really largely lacked the ability to really control what the Indonesian government would do, and also was in a position where Southeast Asia had been so weakened or the stance of the United States had been so weakened by the collapse in Vietnam that it was very unlikely that the United States was going to take a strong stance against one of its remaining allies in Indonesia. And that was something I think both Ford and Nixon were agreed on. There are many other aspects. There are other aspects of Kissinger's misjudgments on the Indo-Pakistan War, also because of an obsession, I think, with China. There were achievements, though, and I think one cannot underestimate. And I think one of the things I tried to do in my biography is try to come to some sort of a balanced judgment on Henry Kissinger. And I think on the Middle East, he played an extraordinary role in setting up at least the beginnings of a peaceful framework in the Middle East. Obviously, that looks a lot further away now than it did maybe even a few months ago, when it looked like Saudi Arabia and Israel were going to make an agreement. But nevertheless, Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy during that period with both Egypt and Syria was, I think, a major achievement for American diplomacy during this period. His détente with the Soviet Union, despite the criticisms, I think, later, was also necessary given American public opinion. And I think it was conducted in a manner that recognized the responsibility of both nuclear powers to being particularly responsible or careful about the dangers of nuclear escalation. And I do think Henry Kissinger, and I'm going to tell a story here from a friend who recently passed away, Ambassador John Kornblum, who was here at Vanderbilt. He worked for Kissinger during this period and remembered presenting Kissinger with a suggestion on the human rights policy in 1975, which Kissinger rejected. Kissinger, in that sense, rejected the idea that human rights had to attain a higher priority in American foreign policy. And Kornblum always felt that Kissinger, in this sense, had become too stubborn and had become blinded and missed the domestic political salience of human rights at this point. And this was one of his mistakes toward the end of his time in office. And that he later, of course, became more sensitive and was, of course, much more willing to talk about human rights, even though in many respects, he certainly did not value it in the same manner as others in international politics. In his early career, Kissinger often referenced the Greek goddess Nemesis, which defeated man by fulfilling his wishes in a different form or answering his prayers too completely. I think Kissinger, who became such a celebrity and who personalized his own foreign policy, got his prayers answered too completely in the sense that he came to be seen as responsible, particularly in a moral sense, for many policies and actions over which he had relatively little influence or control. And I think, to borrow from Jeremy's reference to legitimacy, I think in a sense, Kissinger did worry about the legitimacy of the international system. He was concerned about the policies of countries like Iran with their revolutionary nature, and of course of the Soviet Union early in the Cold War and later in China, and did hope in some sense to achieve a certain stability in international affairs that would prevent the possibility of either nuclear war or serious international warfare. But I think in that sense, he was not as he had that skepticism toward international institutions and international law that Jeremy's referenced, and in a way became targeted as responsible for policies adopted by the United States government that, over which some of which he had influence, but over a period of time that made his own the reference or the reaction to, for example, his passing to be as polarized as it was, and the accusations to be as extreme as they were over his conduct of American foreign policy. So I'll stop there. Maybe we can have a discussion.
Thank you, Tom. And that was wonderful. Both of you remind me how much better it is to be a professor in the arts and sciences where you can talk about Nemesis and you don't have to drop a footnote to explain who that is to our viewers. So I love it. I love it. So Jeremi, maybe you could take a few minutes to comment on anything you heard from Professor Schwartz. Particularly, he went through, the famous Christopher Hitchens indictment of Kissinger, which I don't think you almost got to, but didn't quite get to. And then maybe in about 7 or 8 minutes, we'll turn to questions. We have a lot of them. They're very, I'm looking at them now, very educated and thorough, deep questions. So please send them in. We'll get to as many as you can. Oh, by the way, use the Q&A function, not the webinar chat function. Thank you, everybody. Jeremi.
So that was fantastic, Tom. I always learn so much from your writing and from your presentations. And I think you have really brought out better than anyone else, as you say, Kissinger as politician, as someone who really understood, I think in his terms, that power is political. I mean, he was a student of Clausewitz. He had lived that in World War II, that you can't have power, you can't get things done if you cannot play to the egos, interests, and concerns of various actors. That applies to the international space as well as the domestic space. I mean, what fascinates me, I have no disagreement with anything you've said. What fascinates me, though, is as a political actor, how tone deaf he could sometimes be to the criticisms. that he faced. Our mutual colleague John Gaddis, who we both have enormous respect for, writes very positively about Kissinger's heartland speeches in 75 and 76. When he goes around the country, he goes to Minnesota, he goes to Cleveland, and he tries to convince people, that there's a moral vision there. And I think these speeches go over like a lead balloon. In the 76 election, as we all know, his name becomes almost a curse word, Kissinger does. Ford has to pretend he doesn't know him. And so I guess it's just a question, Tom, and we've actually talked about this before, but would love to hear you reflect on how could someone who was so politically astute at working in the lion's den of Richard Nixon's White House and survive Watergate as almost no one else did, how could he be so tone deaf to other politics around him?
Well, I think he did get more isolated as his both power and celebrity increased, so that he didn't. Early on, he was, he talked a lot with Democrats. He talked a lot. He had a lot of friends among journalists in the establishment, in the Washington Post, New York Times group. And I think that those sorts of relationships benefited him a great deal in the early period of his ascendancy. But as he became more powerful, I think, and as particularly the conservative wing of the Republican Party began to coalesce and be concerned about excessively appeasing the Soviet Union, I think he became less. Those people were not in his group. Those were not the people he was talking to. And I think he became somewhat tone deaf to them. I mean, the Democrats and human rights, in some ways, I mean, he was very good with people like Fulbright. He had a harder time with the McGoverns and others. He could deal with people who were concerned about American power being overextended, but not with people who were concerned about whether we were freeing political dissidents or pushing authoritarian regimes to be more liberal. So I think there may be an element in there of a degree to which he listened to his press clippings more than he dealt with opposition, even though he always had there was always this thing. Walter Isaacson commented in his biography that the way to get Kissinger's attention was to write something critical about him, and then he'd call you up or something. But I think he did become a bit clueless. Brent Scowcroft, who I did have a chance to talk with, said that he thought Kissinger never really connected with a lot of the more conservative Republicans that were developing around Ronald Reagan and others in 76 and that. Now he made an effort afterwards to sort of catch up with that, and he did his best to try and get into the Reagan circle, but he never was trusted by them, and that always kept him, I think, from having the type of influence he wanted to come back as Secretary of State. He wanted to come back and never did. And that is actually one of the interesting stories as well about his career.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add, Tom, to that excellent explanation is, I think one of the things his career warns us about, and I think you implied this in your answer, is the hubris and self-centeredness of power, even for someone who I think is as self-conscious about it as he is. I do think, just as you said, and I think you show this so well in your book, and I recommend it to everyone, he does change over time. And the accretion of power, and particularly during Watergate, I think the absence of the president, I think it does, not necessarily in a legally corrupting, but in a morally corrupting way, in an intellectually corrupting way. And I think he loses perspective, and then I think his hunger for power thereafter almost does a disservice to some of his thinking before. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you see how much he alienated Congress after the 74 elections and really had a hard time dealing with congressional leaders, even though he had a number of them who were his allies or would have been his allies, I do think it became harder for him to accept the type of critique they were offering. He thought they had done a great job, and now these people were coming after him on all the things that they had accomplished. He felt, the relationship with the Soviet Union, which so many had been so concerned with when they were in power, and now it was more balanced, and suddenly everyone was criticizing him for it. Or the SALT agreements, these sorts of things. So I think I would agree with you wholeheartedly that I think there's a hubris here of being unable really to adapt to changing political circumstances in a way. And Gerald Ford tried to school him on this, but Gerald Ford was always in awe of Henry Kissinger. And so I think even that effort did not work as it might have, even when he tried gently in some ways to distance himself. I think other people like Rumsfeld and others wanted to fire Kissinger and get rid of him, and Ford always resisted that.
Having had a chance to meet and work with Rumsfeld in his second tour, I can see that as an attitude Rumsfeld had toward a lot of people. But let me turn to some of these questions. Very interesting. And the first one, I think this is one a lot of people are asking, and maybe I think it ties to some of the themes Jeremi raised. Was there something in the way Kissinger's career, his way of thinking before he became Secretary of State, did it cause him to miss anything about China today? Was he overly optimistic about China? Did it cause him to miss the turn in relations now between China and the US has gone so frosty? And then I think this person might have been in college at Harvard around the Kissinger. He said, did he not learn anything from John Fairbank or Reischauer?
Right, and Reischauer.
Yeah.
It's a
Jeremy, that sounds like it's directed at you. Yeah, this question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the first thing that has to be said, right, is that McCarthyism had an effect in the United States, in the American Academy when Kissinger was there, of limiting access to knowledge on China. This is an old argument that was made about explaining American missteps in Vietnam, and I think it's still true, which is we went in without the body of knowledge you thought we would have had for that region, because following the McCarthyite period, or during the McCarthyite period, people like Owen Lattimore and many others who had a lot to offer were pushed out, especially if they had nice things to say about Mao Zedong. And so even though John Fairbank and Reischauer were around, they were the exceptions to the rule. Kissinger showed very little interest, as far as I can tell, in China during the 1950s and the early 1960s. I think he came to it late. So it's not that he learned the wrong lessons, that he came to it actually with very little knowledge of China. And I think Nixon knew much more about China. Nixon had spent much more time as vice president thinking about China. He had been briefed during the Quemoy Matsui crises and things of that sort. Kissinger was he was around the Council on Foreign Relations. He was around Nelson Rockefeller's group. But at Harvard, I don't think he was really doing much with regard to China. And I think that's why China fell into this template, this model for him of a great civilization, the Germany of Asia, a civilization that had existed for centuries. And he also believed that China recognized that its foremost adversary by the late 60s and early 70s was the Soviet Union, not the United States. They were involved in a shooting war. And in 1969, there was even talk of that war going beyond just a border skirmish. And he recognized and was getting briefings on that to a level that most Americans weren't. So the combination of his, shall we say, schematic view of China, and then the intelligence he was getting on the border conflict, that really colored his view. It's extraordinary, though, the leap that he and Nixon make in reaching out to China. On the one hand, you can say it shows their perspicacity and their courage. On the other hand, it can show their flagrant, reckless behavior. I mean, it's the only time I know, John, where a president goes in 72 to a foreign country without a pre-arranged agenda. You know, when the president comes to Austin, he has a prearranged agenda for every minute, right? They go to China. They don't even know they're going to get the meeting with Mao. They take a lot of risks, and I think that reflects the combination of strategic planning and strategic hope with detailed ignorance that they bring to the table. They rolled the dice, and it happened to work out well, at least in that time.
Can I add, I think also, though, that you can't underestimate the domestic political importance of China. China reversed the polls for a time. It was a popular move to embrace China in 1971. Very, very popular. And Nixon and Kissinger saw this as or Nixon more maybe than Kissinger, but Kissinger too, I mean, the elaborate coverage of the China visit, that the polling afterwards showing that almost every American knew about Nixon going to China, the whole idea that only Nixon could go to China, all of that was really quite an important thing, and I think it had a real impact on Kissinger in terms of his thinking too about the significance of China. He tells a British diplomat in 1973 that China is our best NATO ally. I mean, he was enthusiastic. Yes, we could say some ignorance there, but I think in the tactical terms of the Cold War and the politics of the time, it looked great. Now we have a different perspective on China, but I think we have to keep in mind what happened at that time, or what the conditions were.
I'm pulling together two questions here, which have a very similar theme. That is not surprising. You have a lot of international lawyers listening in. They're very curious about what both of you said about Kissinger's skeptical attitude towards international organizations, and want to ask more about why was that. And so you have two here. One, these are just examples they feel of international organizations that Kissinger was very skeptical of, but they're inviting your broader ideas. Why did Kissinger have such skepticism? So one is the World Trade Organization. So this person writes, would Kissinger actually be happy with the way the Biden and Trump administrations have been so almost hostile to the WTO, and this sort of return of trade sanctions, tariffs, lack of respect for the WTO as a body? And then they say also Kissinger's attitude, of course, personally driven in some way towards the International Criminal Court, and his own personal worry of being indicted and tried by the ICC. But is it personal, this resistance towards international organizations? Is it, Jeremy was suggesting earlier, it's really part of his broader approach to thinking? Some of this is how much of it was skepticism driven while he was Secretary of State, and how much is it driven by what he thinks after he's Secretary of State towards IOs? Jeremy, why don't you go ahead? I think you raised the issue first.
Sure. And I think it's both, right? To the latter part of your question, I think there's a long-standing skepticism, an articulate skepticism, a learned skepticism about international organizations that he has. He's not opposed to them, but he sees them playing a minor role supporting the work of the great powers. Right, they are to support the work of the great powers. They are not to supersede that. And I think that's where the difference really comes in, because the claim that some make through the ICC, and I think it's also a well-formulated claim, is that the ICC in some ways, I think Article 98, right, in some cases would give the ICC the ability to supersede the criminal trial of Slobodan Milosevic being an example, perhaps, of this. So he was skeptical of that. He was not skeptical of the existence of international organizations. You mentioned the WTO. He actually supported Chinese entrance into the WTO. If I remember correctly, I think he was at the White House when Clinton announced that, supportive of a Democratic president bringing China into the WTO, supportive of the idea that this would make China, a responsible stakeholder, I think is the phraseology that was used at the time. Kissinger's skepticism about international organizations was he didn't believe, number one, that they would ever have the power or the cultural capital that the great powers would have. And second, he believed that they could be captured and would be captured often by other actors, that they would have the problems of regulatory capture in their elements. And he had seen that in the General Assembly. He had witnessed how the General Assembly of the United Nations had been transformed around so many issues because of the changing composition of the General Assembly. And so he believed that the organization should be subsumed within this federal structure. And later, when these organizations, particularly the ICC, went after him, it was very personal. He felt, I think, not only that he was being disrespected, he felt he was being constrained from doing the good work he should still be doing. And we should recognize it had an effect. There were parts of the world he couldn't travel to. He had to be careful when he moved in different areas. So no one should deny that this was personal. It would just be improper to say that it didn't have a true intellectual foundation to it as well.
I would add that he did see a relationship between politics and economics. That, for example, when the Europeans came down hard on the Middle East, opposing some of his policies, he was not shy about going after the European Union and working toward and saying, "Look, you guys are getting our protection, and yet you're doing things economically against us, and you're opposing us in policy." So he had a respect for the institutions, and even in the United Nations, he deeply disliked the passage of the resolution comparing Zionism to racism, but at the same time, he didn't want Moynihan to damage the U.S. Role in the UN. So he was ambivalent sometimes about how he wanted to treat international organizations. But I'd largely agree with Jeremi that he saw that they played a role, but they were not they did not have the power to really be decisive in this matter.
There are a series of questions. It's almost like these questions wish Kissinger was around as an AI, and we could just ask him questions about what to do now. So I could put it to you maybe this way. It's kind of like what you were both saying because of his complex mind and his importance. But we've got a lot of foreign policy challenges going on right now. Maybe each of you could pick one and explain what would Kissinger think we should do. Obviously there are questions about Ukraine, Gaza, China. Unfortunately, these days you could go on and on. Russia, maybe, but because there's so many questions of this nature, I would just say maybe each of you could pick one of these hotspot problems we have right now. And what would Kissinger say? What would Kissinger recommend we do? Maybe you could pick one where Kissinger's views might be the most different from what we are doing today. Maybe that would be interesting. But Tom, why don't you start on that one? What is it that? Sorry to stick you with the hard one, but
I have been thinking about this.
What do you think, Kissinger? Yeah, please.
I have been thinking about this a lot in relation to the Middle East, and particularly what Tony Blinken has been trying to do by traveling to different countries. I think Kissinger would have been drawn perhaps to the idea that there's possibilities for a breakthrough. He saw the war in 1973 as opening up possibilities. He might have thought that the Hamas-Israeli war opened up new possibilities, but I think he would have also recognized that it also had it created certain problems as well. But I think particularly the idea that there could be some sort of a trade-off or settlement here, giving Palestinians greater autonomy or something resembling a state in return for Saudi Arabian recognition of Israel and a role in rebuilding Saudi Arabia and Egypt, say a role in rebuilding Gaza or also helping in the West Bank. So I think he might have thought that there might be the possibility of arranging something like that as a way of, and then using that as a way of trying to organize a coalition against the Iranians, who are playing the key role, it seems to me, in trying to disrupt any type of American vision. He was supportive of the Abraham Accords and thought that they were a step forward. You're right, Jeremy's right about his view of the Palestinians, but I think he might have seen, just as he came to see in '73 the importance of Egypt and later the importance of Syria as well as in negotiating, that he might have seen an importance if we could find Palestinians were willing to work with the Egyptians and Saudis, perhaps in some sort of a comprehensive settlement. But I have thought that Blinken, in replicating the sort of travels, is at least trying to do something along those lines. The great thing that Kissinger had in 1973 that Blinken does not have is that Iran at that time was our ally and was favorably disposed to Israel. Iran's situation now, in many respects, maybe resembles more what the Soviet Union was doing at the time, or at least its concerns and role in that. So that would be my thought, that he might have been advising along those lines.
Well, I'll go maybe in a surprising direction. I agree with everything that Tom said. I think at the end of his life, and I think if he were still around today, Kissinger would emphasize his cosmopolitanism. This is a big theme of my book, that he is a true cosmopolitan. He is possible because the United States internationalizes. When he's a student at Harvard, he's in a Jewish-only dorm. When he becomes Secretary of State, he's the first Jewish Secretary of State. He really saw the strength of the United States as an assimilationist vision. It's maybe an older vision, but a vision I still find compelling, of bringing people from different parts of the world together, and that the United States being a special country for people from different parts of the world. Where am I going with this? I think he'd be appalled at our immigration policies. I think Kissinger was a supporter of allowing talented people to come into the United States and become citizens. What he had experienced with his own family coming in 1938, of opening our institutions to them, he would push back very hard on the isolationist elements, John, that I see in both parties right now. The notion that you would tie the future security of Europe, whatever you're doing in Ukraine, to the border, and that you would hold both hostage for political reasons. I think that would be a step too far for him. I think he would warn against us, and he would remind us that the American dream is a dream of immigration and a dream of supporting free peoples around the world. I fear too many people in our society have forgotten that, John, and I worry about that.
I have to say, just as moderator, I do share your views on that too, but I'm the moderator. I can't say anything about that. To quote my favorite British political sitcom, you might think that I could not possibly comment, which is from House of Cards, House of Cards. So this is actually, this is a really interesting question from an economist who says economists who study Kissinger have criticized him actually for leaving economics out of the way he thought about things, or tended to downplay economics as a tool of statecraft, or would sometimes miss very important economic dimensions of some of the decisions, to the point, I guess this person quotes Peter Drucker, a well-known economist, who said, quote, Kissinger's refusal to include economics in his plans and policies was a blunder of the first magnitude, unquote. What do you think about that? Did Kissinger have sort of a blind spot with economics, or did he really think of it, just thought it wasn't as important? Is this something that actually you could probably make this criticism of American foreign policy since too, right? But is this, what do you think of this comment from the economics part of the audience?
Tom, why don't you go first?
Okay, he did downplay it. I think he knew more about it than he deliberately, in some senses, absented himself from a lot of the economic policy making. One of the most important steps Nixon did in his first term was, of course, breaking the bond between gold and the dollar, and ending the Bretton Woods system. And this created an enormous disruption with the Allies that Kissinger ended up having to play a role in trying to ease over, especially John Connally, who was sort of an early version of Donald Trump in the way he talked about the Europeans and the way he discussed these matters. Kissinger did, as Secretary of State, find himself involved with more of the economic issues, the food crisis in 1975, and some of the questions of the new international economic order, which he sort of finessed in some ways or moved away from. But he was not, I think it probably is fair to say that this did not preoccupy him. I think he felt that he could work with others on that. I think later, as he became an international consultant and in his private sector work, he became much more caught up with economic issues, trade issues, and the rest. And eventually, I think we may have work that will document that more fully about his career after he was Secretary of State. But that would be my take on that.
The only thing,
Jeremy, 2 minutes before we have to end. Sorry.
A short addition to Tom's really thoughtful answer, and I wonder if you'll agree, Tom. I think he also in part stayed away from economic policy in the Nixon administration because Nixon was so obsessed with economics and its relationship to his reelection. And so Kissinger was carving out a space for himself, it seemed to me, as the strategic specialist, leaving the economics to Arthur Burns, who was chair of the Federal Reserve, and George Shultz and others. Do you agree with that, Tom?
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. It's not as if he didn't. I mean, he dealt with the repercussions from the decisions. He had to deal with the diplomacy in that. But yes.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. And I'm going to turn the session back over to Jack Capizzi to close. And again, Tom and Jeremy, thank you very much. This was really wonderful. This is the is it fair to say the best time I've ever had on a Federal Society podcast?
That is high compliment, John. Thank you. And thanks so much.
Or no, it's hard to say. Jack, please.
Well, thank you, John. I certainly agree with what you have to say there. And on behalf of the Federalist Society, I just want to extend a thank you to Professor Suri and Professor Schwartz for being so generous with their time and expertise today, and of course to you as well, Professor Yu, for moderating. If you'd like to watch a recording of this discussion, it will be made available on YouTube immediately after we're done here today, and then it will be re-uploaded to our website later on. As always, we do welcome listener feedback at info@fed-soc.org. And with that, thank you all very much for being with us today. We are adjourned.
Thank you for listening to this episode of FedSoc Forums, a podcast of the Federal Society's practice groups. For more information about the Federal Society, the practice groups, and to become a Federal Society member, please visit our website at fedsoc.org.